My question has to do with the religious history in the Mediterranean, and it appears as though Jesus' bio, as it was going around the Mediterranean for 1,000 years before him, as well as for example, Osiris' son Horus has pretty much the exact same bio, and I was wondering how you reconcile your faith and the historical accounts of the time.
Hey everyone! Today's video is by Dr. William Lane Craig, where he responds to a student's question about the alleged parallels between Jesus and the Egyptian gods Osiris and Horus. It's a topic that's been circulating for a while, so I'm excited to share with you guys Dr. Craig's take on it, and stick to the end if you want to hear my thoughts on it.
Hi, thank you very much for coming today. My name is Shane. I'm a history major here at UCF. And my question has to do with the religious history in the Mediterranean, and it appears as though Jesus' bio, as it was going around the Mediterranean for 1,000 years before him, as well as for example, Osiris' son Horus has pretty much the exact same bio, and I was wondering how you reconcile your faith and the historical accounts of the time.
You know, I have to say, in all gentleness, that that's just based on misinformation. This is garbage that's spread on the internet that just isn't true. And what's really funny about this is that these people who say this kind of thing never seem to quote the primary sources. They tell you that this is in Osiris or Horus, but you never see the primary sources quoted. When you look at the primary sources, you find out they're not at all parallel to the Gospels. And this movement to try to explain Jesus of Nazareth and Christianity against the backdrop of pagan mythology, Greco-Roman and other religions, was very popular back around the late 1800s or so in Germany. And the movement soon collapsed for two reasons. One was that when you examined the primary sources closely, they weren't really parallel. The parallels were spurious. There's nothing comparable, for example, to the resurrection of Jesus in pagan religions. Secondly, in any case, there was no causal connection between these myths and Jesus of Nazareth or the earliest disciples. In fact, one of the things that has characterized contemporary scholarship about the historical Jesus is what has been called the Jewish reclamation of Jesus. What has happened is that New Testament scholars have come to understand that Jesus of Nazareth was a Jew, and all of the disciples were Jews, and that therefore it is against the backdrop of first century Palestinian Judaism that Jesus is to be properly understood, not against the background of pagan mythology and pagan religion. And so what scholars have come to appreciate is this earlier approach back in the late 1800s, which is completely wrong-headed because it didn't understand the Jewishness of Jesus. And when you read Jesus against a Jewish milieu, the credibility of the Gospels has been tremendously enhanced. And this is, as I say, a movement that is in part being spearheaded by Jewish scholars and historians. And I spoke with James Crossley at the University of Sheffield a couple of years ago about this Jewish reclamation of Jesus. And I said, why do you think it was that this approach to Jesus in German theology used this pagan mythology as the interpretive grid for Jesus? Why, when it's so obviously wrong? And he said it was because of German anti-Semitism. And all of a sudden, the light just sort of went on for me. I thought, oh man, this is exactly the same sort of anti-Semitism that led to National Socialism in Germany right up through the Second World War. They wanted an Aryan Jesus. They didn't want a Jewish Jesus. And so New Testament theology was derouted into this interpreting Jesus in the framework of these pagan religions, which is a total distortion of who Jesus really was. So I would encourage you, you should just divest yourself of this point of view. It's utterly outmoded among scholars. There's a very good article that I can refer you to on this. It's by Mark Foreman, And it's going to be in the volume called Come Let Us Reason, which is being edited by myself and Paul Copan with Broadman and Holman. It's coming out probably in a month or two. And Mark has a wonderful analysis of the Zeitgeist movie. Have you heard of that movie, Zeitgeist? It makes this claim about Horus and Egyptian religion. And Mark Foreman just takes this to pieces. I mean, it's a piece of theological and historical dismantlement. So look at Foreman's piece if you don't believe me, and see if what I've said isn't correct.
Craig started by addressing the claim that Jesus' story is essentially a copy of these ancient Egyptian myths. He argues that this idea is fundamentally flawed, and I've got to say, his reasoning is pretty compelling. First, let's talk about the historical context. Craig points out that the myths of Osiris and Horus evolved over thousands of years and varied significantly across different time periods and locations in ancient Egypt. This is crucial because it highlights the difficulty in drawing direct parallels with the Jesus narrative, which has a much more specific historical and cultural context. Now let's break down some of the key differences Craig mentions. 1. Resurrection. Craig emphasizes that Jesus' bodily resurrection is fundamentally different from what happens to Osiris. In the Egyptian myth, Osiris becomes the god of the underworld, not returning to earthly life. This contrasts sharply with Jesus' resurrection, where he physically returns and interacts with his disciples. As 1 Corinthians 15:20 states, "But Christ has indeed been raised from the dead, the first fruits of those who have fallen asleep." 2. Historical specificity. The Jesus narrative is set in a specific historical and geographical context, with named individuals and places. The Gospels present Jesus as a real person who lived and died in Roman-occupied Judea. This level of historical detail is absent in the Osiris and Horus myths. 3. Theological significance. Craig points out that the meaning and purpose of Jesus' life, death, and resurrection are unique. The Christian concept of atonement for sins and reconciliation with God is not present in the Egyptian myths. This is reflected in Romans 5:8. But God demonstrates his own love for us in this: while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. I did some additional research, and it's worth noting that many scholars agree with Craig's assessment. For instance, the idea of dying and rising gods in ancient myths is more complex than often portrayed. Many of these deities, including Osiris, are associated with cyclical nature myths rather than a one-time resurrection event like Jesus. One thing that really struck me is how Craig's arguments highlight the uniqueness of the Christian narrative. The Gospel accounts present Jesus not as a mythical figure, but as a historical person whose life and teachings had a profound impact on his followers and the world. As John 1:14 puts it, "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." Now, I know this is a complex and sometimes controversial topic. While Craig makes a strong case, it's always good to approach these discussions with an open mind and a willingness to engage with different perspectives. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Let's have a respectful and engaging discussion about this fascinating intersection of history, mythology, and faith. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this deep dive, and hit that notification bell to stay updated on future videos where we explore these kinds of thought-provoking topics.